Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I just travelled down by train this morning from Sheffield, where I work at the university in Sheffield, and walked up from the station to here just now. And as I was doing so, I suddenly realised that 40 years ago to the day, I did the same thing because I studied here in Bristol and I studied botany just around the corner. When there was a botany course here, and now it's no longer a subject you can study, not just here but anywhere. All the botany courses have disappeared from the UK. And I guess I chose to study botany for a particular reason, because I've been one of these really precocious people that kind of knew what they were interested in from a very small age. So I've always been fascinated by plants. Oh, I have to stand up. Oh, I have to stand up on the stage. So, I've always known really what I wanted to do ever since being very small. And I knew that it would involve plants. And I guess I was very lucky in that my parents were very keen gardeners and had a garden, and they gave me a little patch, just a metre or so in area when I was quite small. And I did the usual thing, growing radishes and salad plants and so on, and just became fascinated. And one of my earliest recollections, I think, was with my parents taking a cutting of a weeping willow tree, sticking it in a pot, and a month or two later, shoots appearing from this twig, and then roots appearing at the base of the pot. And I was only 5, I think, and that was kind of the most magical thing to me, that this new life was appearing. And this little cutting was planted in the garden, and as I grew up, this tree grew up with me. And I just became fascinated by the whole thing about growing plants and nurturing plants. To the extent that I guess my kind of teenage fantasies were about, I kind of get seed catalogues and just fantasize about all the different lettuces and radishes and marigolds you could grow and all the bedding plants. And my horticultural world was really narrow. It was very traditional. It was based upon very traditional horticulture. But at the same time, as I was growing up, we lived in the countryside. I got to explore meadows and woodlands and really experienced beautiful nature. And I was again very lucky going to little village school, and every Friday, I think over the summer, we had a retired teacher came in to do nature walks with us and would take us around the local woods and fields and pointed out the names of the plants, but not the scientific names. It was the common names, cuckoo flower or lady's smock or whatever. And there was something about these common names that captured my imagination. It gave the plants a personality, I think. And again, I really just became fascinated. And as I was growing up and really exploring the countryside, I started to feel that the things I was seeing and experiencing and learning about and visiting and doing in gardens never gave me the same sort of feeling as what I experienced in nature, in a wonderful woodland full of bluebells in the spring, or a hedgerow full of dripping fruit in the autumn. And I guess even at the age, about 16, 17, 18, I started to think, why was that? What was different about gardens and natural experiences? And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through. As I was growing up again, my mother and father were in the local gardening club in the village, and one year, I think when I was 11 or 12, the local garden society went to Wisley on a coach trip as their annual outing. And we looked around the garden, and as you do, you leave through the bookstore. And at the time, the bookshop at Wisley, the Royal Horticultural Society's headquarters, was really the best garden bookshop in the world. And I just pored over the bookshelves. And there was one book that I saw that kind of intrigued me because it was different to all the others that were there. It was a Penguin paperback, and it had the orange spine. And I pulled it out, and there was a picture of a lovely garden on the front, but no photos in it really, apart from a few black and white ones in the middle. It was just all writing. And it looked like a novel, but it was kind of really, I suppose, just grabbed my attention again. So I bought it not knowing a thing about it, and started reading it on the bus on the way back. And it was a book called The Well-Tempered Garden by Christopher Lloyd, and I had no idea who he was or what great Dixter was. And I started reading this book, and suddenly, I think at the age of 12 or 13, I realized that there was more to gardens and horticulture than lettuces and radishes and marigolds. And more than that, I realized there was kind of an intellectual side to gardening and horticulture. You know, you could have ideas and you could talk about ideas, and it was kind of exciting. And you know, as many of you know, the thing about Christopher Lloyd was, you know, break the rules, don't follow the rules, break the rules, do your own thing. And I think the thing that struck me more than anything else about The Well-Tempered Garden, that it was funny. You know, it was almost laugh out loud funny in places, and all the way up until then, gardens had never been fun, very serious, and, you know, kind of lots of hard work. So just reading that book opened my eyes completely to what horticulture was all about. So coming up to the time, I'm kind of leading on to why I came here. You know, I'd really read, I'd visited, I'd kind of taught myself quite a bit about gardens and horticulture already. I felt that I really could teach myself all of that just by doing it. And also garden design, landscape design, which is sort of the field I work in now. But what I thought I could never teach myself properly was the science of plants and botany and ecology. So I decided to try and get a full scientific education in how plants worked and how they interacted and how they work with ecosystems. And of course, as it turned out, Bristol was the place to come and do that, really. So it was hugely formative to me to do that. And then 3 years after coming, I graduated from this very hall. So this is a bit of a deja vu. I have to say that the walk up from the station to here now is far more pleasant and far more green and far more understandable than it was then, when it was almost an impossible thing, to me anyway, as a student here at Bristol, to find my way on foot from here down to the station. But now, of course, things have changed. So what I would like to do is to address the topic of, how can horticulture help to address some of the major local and global issues that we face, from my particular perspective, which is, I think, exactly linked into what I just talked about. It's how to bring the worlds of horticulture and ecology together in our gardens and our design landscapes and our public and private places. And I would just like to introduce it by describing a project, a site I visited about 20 years ago. I've done a lot of work with green roofs and urban greening and putting plants into places you wouldn't think were the obvious places for them. And when I first became interested in this, I went to a conference. It was the first green roof conference in the world, and it was in Chicago in 2003. And it was held in Chicago because at the time Chicago was really leading the States in becoming a green city. There were a lot of planning regulations encouraging people to create green roofs, to create new green spaces, and in particular to put a lot of greening on the streets, even if it was just temporary. And the city government, the city council, really said, we want to transform Chicago from an industrial city into a green economy. And as well as passing all of these regulations and planning restrictions, they kind of said, well, we can't tell everybody else how to do it if we're not prepared to do it ourselves, if we're not prepared to lead. So one of the things that they did was to take their city government building and put an amazing green roof on it to say, well, look, we can do it. Come on, everybody else, you can do it. And this is the building. And I got to see it in 2003 when it was very young, very new. The reason I pick up on this is because, as you can see here, it only covers half of the building. The city government only had half the building. The other half of it was privately owned, so they could only put the green roof on half the building. And it's an amazing green roof. You can't quite tell from this image, but there's a landform, a topography on it. There's hills and valleys. And they built the hills up with insulation, lightweight polystyrene, and then put a thin layer of soil over the top. And there were trees on there. And all the plants were native to the region. Their definition of native was anything that grows naturally within a 150-mile radius of Chicago. So a lot of prairie plants, Midwestern plants. And kind of a tourist attraction, people pay to go up and visit it, so it generates income. But as I said, only covering half the building. And when I look at, well, there's an image of the vegetation now, sort of prairie-type ecosystem on the roof. But when you look at this image, which is a close-up of half of the rooftop, which is greened, it's quite deep soil, really rich, diverse green, and half of which isn't. And just have to imagine yourself being on that rooftop. And let's say you're on a really hot summer's day when the air temperature might be 30, 35 degrees, the temperature on the roof surface might be 50 degrees. Where would you rather stand? Barefoot. Would you rather stand on the green side or the grey side? Imagine on that same hot summer's day there was a torrential thunderstorm developed, as often happens in the afternoon. You have sort of huge downpour. What's going to happen to that rain that falls on the green side of the roof? What's going to happen to the rain that falls on the grey side of the roof? The green side is like a giant sponge, isn't it? On the grey side, that's just going to run off straight into the drainage system. If you were a bird or an insect, where would you rather be at any time of the year, but maybe in particular on that hot day? Where would you, as a person, prefer to be? What would you prefer to be looking out on if you were working in an office overlooking this, the green side or the grey side? Now, the answers are obvious, aren't they? Maybe some of you would rather look at the grey or be on the grey, but I think most of you would say, I would rather be on the green, and we all know why that is. But then if you think about the everyday experience of pretty much all of us as we go about our daily business in a city, the reality is that mostly our environment is the grey, isn't it? And when you look at something like this, you say, well, it's crazy. Why would we want to surround ourselves by this bleak, sterile, grey environment? Why wouldn't we want to surround ourselves by the diverse, functioning green environment? It seems so obvious. And yet it doesn't happen. The environment that most of us live in is much more typical of the grey side. And, more and more, we need to change that. So that's really where the topic of today comes in. We're all familiar with these ideas of why we need to work with the green. It's called nature-based solutions to all the major problems we face. But what I would like to try and get across is that to some extent, to me, is a meaningless term. The same as green infrastructure is a meaningless term, and kind of ecosystem services, to some extent, is very jargonistic, because when we say nature-based solutions, what do we mean by nature? Is it just anything that's green, or anything that has some sort of soil and kind of plant interaction? Is that going to do the job? Or are there types of green or types of nature that are better than other types of green or other types of nature? And we haven't really got that far yet in being able to differentiate any sort of greening as opposed to really specific sorts of greening. And again, this is really where the world of horticulture has not just got a role to play, I think it's got the leading role to play, and that's something that hopefully will start to develop into the future. Now I'm going to have to turn around and face the screen here. I wrote a book about green roofs because of this interest in green roofs, and this is a quote, we put at the start, from Friedenreich Hundertwasser, who was an Austrian artist and architect, an anarchist, and really developed a lot of buildings like this, which were forested buildings or wooded buildings. In fact, sometimes windows would be left glassless with a tree put in the building and the tree would come out of the window. And this is a quote from him, and I think although it's in the context of roof greening, we should read it in the context of horticulture or urban greening or just greening now. So I'll try and swap some of the wording. So everything that under the heavens or under the sky that is horizontal belongs to nature. We must be persistent in the quest to green or to forest all the rooftops so that from a bird's eye view, you'd only recognize a natural green landscape. When you create green roofs, let's call it greening any surface, any surface. You don't need to fear the so-called paving of the landscape because the houses or the buildings themselves become the landscape. People must use the roofs, let's say any sort of surface, to return to nature what we unlawfully took from her by constructing our homes and buildings, that layer of earth and life and ecology. Now that's very idealistic in a way, but I think that's what drives a lot of people in this field because that's a vision for the future. And like I said, it's not just about roof greening anymore. It's about really looking at any sealed or hard surface that's not providing a positive function and saying, well, what can we do with that? So gardens and horticulture, I think to the general public, maybe to many of us, because in the UK it's such a common thing, you know, it's the biggest leisure activity in the UK, that it's often not taken very seriously. It's kind of a fun thing. It's a sort of frivolous thing, and in particular because so much of horticulture, decorative horticulture, to use an awful phrase, is cosmetic, it is ornamental, to use another dreadful phrase in horticulture, ornamental horticulture. And as a result, I think because it's popular and because it's associated with making things look nice, it's not necessarily taken that seriously politically by decision makers. But when you think about it, of course, you know, horticulture, gardens and landscapes should be at the forefront of meeting some of these huge challenges. Now, I don't need to go into this. You know, the major challenges we face of climate change, climate emergency, population change across the world, really movement of people from countryside to cities and causing increasing pressure, but also increasing densification of cities. And then, of course, the biodiversity, habitat, and nature crisis. All of these three things are kind of linked together, of course. The negative aspects of these three challenges are probably magnified in cities, way beyond the way that they may play out in other areas. And that, of course, is because in cities, we don't have that layer of soil or vegetation to cool things down, to soak up rainwater, to support other life. And so places heat up, they dry out, they become flooded, people lose contact with nature, and we have all sorts of health and social issues. So if you kind of accept that, you know, there's a link between the lack of nature and the lack of green, then one of the major ways that we can address these challenges to bring it back. And it has to be soils, and it has to be vegetation, and it has to be the whole ecosystem, because without all of these things interacting, we don't get those benefits of those nature-based solutions. And as soon as we start to talk about soils and vegetation and nature as a complex, then we start to go into the world of gardens and horticulture. And that's one of the reasons why it's so crucial. I think that the time for playing around the edges with this sort of thing is in the past now. So just putting a green roof on a building somewhere, a little patch of meadow on the ground somewhere else, a rain garden to soak up flooding waters somewhere else is great because that will have some benefit, but it will only have benefit to that particular building or that particular area. What we have to do is to do these things on a large scale, and on such a scale that it's transformational. You know, it changes the way places look. It changes the way people use them. It changes who uses them, who they're for. It changes how they have to be looked after, how they have to be managed. And that's challenging because it's about doing things differently. And, you know, everything, we all are ingrained in the way we do things, you know, and if we personally get ingrained in doing certain things certain ways, imagine how difficult it is to change an organization whether it's a university, whether it's a city council, whether it's just a small firm or company, to change behaviours to such an extent that it meets these challenges. But like I've said at the end, I think this is where the link is, that of course there's a lot of interest, rightly so, in wilding and rewilding and letting natural processes take their course. But it sounds great, doesn't it? But the fact is that if you do rely on that, then the sort of nature, particularly in cities, that you end up with is maybe not the lovely romantic picture of nature that you would like to have. You know, you don't know what's going to come. In cities, you have a lot of invasive plants. It's a lot of, you know, maybe not many propagules of all the desirable species that you want. So I think that as well as really encouraging and letting natural processes happen, we have to plan for this transformational green, and we have to design it to some extent, and we have to nurture it. We have to look after it. It's something that's precious. And when we start to talk about planning and designing, nurturing with green and with nature, what does that mean? That's horticulture and that's gardens. So I think the idea of the garden as an idea, not necessarily a physical thing, is such a big thing for the future. And I'll try and kind of pull a few things out from that as we go through. Now, when we start to talk about transformational greening, then there are different ways of doing it. I walked up here past College Green. Let's take that as an example. Beautiful bedding displays. I love bedding. I mean, as I said, I started out in traditional horticulture working with annual plants. Beautiful, beautiful purple and pink bedding in a ribbon around the base of the building in a flower bed. And then short mown, probably low diversity grassland everywhere around. So we can take these spaces that we already have and think about how to do those differently. So as I went to have a look at this beautiful bedding, I thought to myself, there's just this arc of sterile water at the base of the building. Well, why couldn't that be a wonderful wetland full of, you know, aquatic native plants and maybe circulating water through that to clean it and purify it? Why can't that bedding be replaced by something equally colourful and exciting, but something that's also ecologically diverse? Do we need all of that mown grass, low diversity mown grass? Can we have flowering lawns? Can we have some areas of a flowering meadow as well as having that recreational grass? So we have that sense of really looking at the spaces we have and seeing what we can do differently. But then there's also, where do we put the new green? And in most cities, if that's where a lot of the need is, there isn't the opportunity to kind of demolish huge swathes of buildings and create new parks and green spaces. There's a lot of demand for different uses for that space. So we have to be really radical and really innovative with where we think the new green will go. And of course the rooftops is one place for that. The walls is another. But then we have the pavements, the roads, the streets, thank you. Hopefully you won't have to keep doing that. The roads, the streets, I've listed them here, I think. When I say sort of traditional green space is not enough. We have car parks, all of this space, all around us, just grey, water-shedding space. You know, what about making car parks into arboreta with wonderful trees and having green car parks with shade canopy over the top that keeps the cars cool in the summer? What else have I put there? We've got business parks, commercial developments, all these places that perhaps you would never think were places for horticulture are the new opportunities for horticulture. In just the same way that maybe 30 or 40 years ago people would say that, oh, you'd never be able to grow plants on a rooftop. And now green roofs are pretty much part of the mainstream. So I think to be effective, new urban greening must be on a large and transformational scale, like I've said. But this is the key thing, and this is another thing, another reason that I want to dwell on about why horticulture and the garden ethic, if you like, is so important, because it has to work to meet these challenges, but it has to work for people too. It has to be beautiful or attractive or acceptable. And people have been talking about the need to bring green and ecology into cities and to make our living and working spaces more ecological. I know people have been talking about it my entire life, and from earlier, since the 1950s, 1960s, there's been an urban greening movement in the UK and in the States. And let's say 1960s, so 50, 60 years later, it's still not the mainstream. And people have been talking about it and saying how it has to be the most wonderful thing. Well, why isn't it the mainstream? And I think one of the reasons is that the people have not been put at the heart of the urban greening movement. It's been about ecology and function, of course. And whether it works for people has been a secondary consideration. So many people I've talked to, and I can kind of understand this, working in this field, let's say making a wonderful piece of meadow or wild landscape in the city, will say, well, we need to educate people. People might not like it, but we need to educate people. People need to be made aware of the benefits. Of course they do. But to me, we cannot do that on every single site or every single project. To me, what we do in ecological and sustainable terms has to be kind of immediately grabbing people's attention. It has to immediately be something that people say, yeah, I like that. It has to immediately be something that people say, I don't want to see any more of that, thank you. It has to be something people say, not only, well, I really like that, I want to see more of it. I want to see it down my street. I want to see it in my park. So I think I've kind of come to think that maybe, at least to kick things off, we need to have a people-first agenda. And that really is something that, in a way, doesn't go down very well, because when you say it has to be people first, to really make these things happen, then people say, well, no, we've done enough for people. This has to be biodiversity first. It has to be ecology first. And of course, I would agree with that conceptually. But I think where we start to bring in the idea of the garden and horticulture is this people-first approach, to kick things off, to pull things back into the mainstream. And one of the reasons for that is that, because in the city we are not dealing with a natural environment, we're not dealing with natural soils in most places, we're dealing with soils that have been disturbed and reworked and, for centuries often, and have nothing to do with the natural condition. There's no connection with the natural geology in any way, shape or form. The climate's completely different. The urban heat island, the climate will be many degrees higher than in the hinterland or the surrounding countryside. And the humidity will be different as well. So to simply say we just need to take a plant community or a habitat that happens outside the city and kind of recreate it in the middle of the city, and that's how we do it, that isn't necessarily going to be sustainable in the long term because the conditions are so different. So again, I think we need to think differently about what nature is into the future. So I think, ecology in cities has always been about fusion. It's about things coming together, recombining. And you go to any wasteland, so-called wasteland or brownfield site, and see what comes up naturally. And it will be a combination of invasive native plants, but also invasive non-native plants, escapees from gardens and parks, or plants that have been kind of pulled in through the effects of people. And I think that's an incredibly exciting thing. So this sort of natural plant community that happens spontaneously on abandoned sites in cities, to me, is as valid a plant community, a semi-natural, natural plant community, as a wonderful meadow in the countryside, because it's totally and utterly fitted to those site conditions. It's happened there by itself. So this idea of recombining a recombinant ecology is so topical. And when we think about gardens, that's what gardens are, of course. It's this hybrid of people and nature coming together. So I think we need to think perhaps about a new nature, a sort of future nature, and an artful ecology in places in cities. And that, again, is my definition perhaps of what gardens might be, because we have the power, when we do this, to make things or produce things or encourage things that are beautiful, that people really like, that people want to live with, but do these other things as well, that cool down cities that were overheated, clean up polluted cities, dry out flooded cities, or rehydrate dry cities. What an amazing thing to do, to be able to do with the idea of the garden. But this is a very different situation, of course, than oh no, where we would normally think horticulture might be the best situation. So I think I can remember what's coming next, and I have, actually one of our graduates is now head of parks in Barcelona, where they're doing a lot of really exciting things. And he gave a presentation to our students as part of a virtual field trip I had to organize to Barcelona last year. And he really talked about what's been happening in Barcelona, where they've been reclaiming the streets for people. And Barcelona's a bit of a strange city in terms of the UK, because it's a gridded city, and you have a grid system of the roads, and then blocks of residential or commercial buildings between the gridded road system. And over the last few years, really through local initiatives, cars have been pushed further and further away from these blocks, these residential blocks, to the extent now that large parts of residential neighborhoods in Barcelona are car-free. And the streets have been given back to people for parks and for play areas and for gathering spaces. And Gabino, my former student, said something which I thought was excellent. He said, you know, where will the gardens of the future be? What will the gardens of the future be? And he said, to him, the gardens of the future in the city will be on the streets. And the places that we think at the moment are for cars will be for people, and the places that we think are grey will be green. And we start to see that happening in London. You know, amazing proposals for the Strand, which is kind of chock full of cars and buses. That's going to be completely pedestrianised and turned over to a park. And there are various other initiatives happening that, again, even a few years ago you would think would be science fiction proposals. That's starting to come. So I'm going to move forward there. This is, I saw this last year just by accident. It's next to St Pancras Station in London. And this is a bioswale, which is, a bioswale is a fancy word for a ditch. It's basically a depression where water can collect and can move along. And it's part of the whole movement for water-sensitive design and sustainable urban drainage. And on the street here, on the right, this timber edge is a bench, a long bench that people can sit on, but it also stops people falling in to the ditch. And they'd seeded one of my meadow mixes in there, just temporarily before the final planting happened. And it was such a surprise to me to come into London, come out of St Pancras Station and see this colourful, diverse strip on the street. And I think it's just a little foretaste of how dramatic the change is going to be over the next few years. I think we'll start to see this sort of thing popping up all over. So yeah, this is Gabino's quote, really, which I've just said to you. The streets will be shaped by people and nature, not by cars. So, of course, you know, in this different way of looking at things, we can bring wild, or we can bring nature to places that would have been thought impossible. This is an image from the Barbican. So I think really, to me, the exciting prospect is to push to infiltrate this sort of transformational nature everywhere, because really there isn't anywhere where it's not possible. We have the technology to do it. So I just wanted to mention this here. I mentioned Great Dixter and Christopher Lloyd, and many of you would have been there, I'm sure, and know about it. But this is one of probably the most famous UK garden now around the world. And it's amazing because it's this kind of mix of traditional horticulture and crazy experimental horticulture. And it kind of, at the moment, with Fergus Garrett, who's the head gardener there, I think it's kind of this mix between complete craziness and wonderfulness, and it just makes that kind of fits that balance really, really nicely. But I love this image here, which is of the long border here. Because Great Dixter itself is surrounded as part of the estate by ancient woodlands and grasslands, and then this highland of horticulture in the middle. And you can kind of see that there's this, in just a few meters, there's this gradient from a traditional horticultural aesthetic and the intensive maintenance that that entails, and then an ecological aesthetic, and with meadows and a much lower intensity maintenance. It's kind of interesting to me, looking at this image here on the right, you've probably got 1 plant per square meter on average. And on the left, you maybe have 50, 100, 200 plants a square meter on average. And on the left, maybe there's an equal number of flowers overall than there is on the right. It's just that on the left, each individual plant is producing just 1, 2, 3 flowers, whereas on the right, a single plant is producing loads of flowers. So we kind of achieve the same floriferousness, but just in different ways. And I show this because I think one of the most important pieces of scientific work was done not really at a university in the horticultural world, but here. And some of you might know about the Great Dixter Biodiversity Audit that was carried out 2 years ago. Almost by accident, because I think Fergus Garrett says, they had a meeting. Great Dixter is a meeting place for various societies, and they had an entomological society grouping meeting, I think, or spider specialist meeting held at Great Dixter. And Fergus just said to the people there, well, why don't you come and have a look at the spiders in the garden? And he said, I think the response was, it's not even worth us having a look at the garden. There'll be nothing there. There's nothing of any interest to us in a garden. But then I think he did invite one person to have a look around who was just amazed at what they found. And as a result of that, they organized a systematic scientific study of pretty much everything that occurred in the wider estate as well as in the gardens. I'll come back to those results in a minute, but I just got a bit out of sequence. This is images of my own garden. And I just wanted to make the point, I suppose, of it's kind of this mixing of diversity of vegetation and then elements for habitat and biodiversity. And I've tried to do that in my own garden by kind of mixing together, but in a way, I think, that's different to how you would normally think about an eco-garden, where often it's a few things thrown into a corner or a pile of that. It's very untidy often, and has this image of scruffiness. And to me, it's been really important that the eco-horticulture is smart and neat and artful as well. So that's what I've kind of tried to do here. Anyway, that was a slight aside, I think. Yeah. I just lifted this quote from Fergus Garrett, the head gardener at Gardens Illustrated. It's a big report, a scientific report, but this is a kind of popular summary that Fergus wrote in Gardens Illustrated last year. I just quickly read this out. Archaeologists, naturalists, ecologists, botanists, and entomologists were commissioned to carry out the survey, dividing the Great Dixter Estate into different zones, such as woodlands, pasture, and meadows, ornamental gardens, ponds, and an open field. Each zone was surveyed and the findings fed to one principal ecologist who analysed and pulled the information together. The results were astonishing. As expected, the wider estate with its ancient woodlands, pastures and meadows and ponds was extremely rich, but surprisingly, the richest part of all was the ornamental garden, although all zones worked together with one feeding another, of course, as a system. The survey clearly showed the garden, even with its high displays of ornamental horticulture, supported an extraordinary amount of wildlife. They hadn't specifically created a wildlife or habitat garden. To do that, there was an exceptional assemblage of birds. Over 40% of the UK's bee species were found within 1 year, rare and scarce butterflies. Some which had thought to be extinct in Surrey were found as part of the survey at Great Dixter. It soon became obvious that there was a significant pollinator community, including a high abundance of nationally rare and scarce bees, wasps, hoverflies, and moths. Well, this went on, but importantly, Great Dixter provided a diversity of food sources, of course, through the diversity of vegetation, coupled with the diversity of habitats. And it's a mosaic of habitats within the gardens. Sorry, you just stretching at the back, not signaling. I thought you were signaling to me to stand up straighter or something. So, as it says here, that the lead ecologist, Andy Phillips, who was initially lukewarm about finding anything, really now sees the garden at Great Dixter as an important nature reserve. So, this and really increasing amounts of evidence suggest that we should think differently about gardens and habitats and wildlife, and we should think differently about this binary thing about the only thing you can do that's going to be good for wildlife and biodiversity is to grow native plants and to kind of try and recreate native ecosystems. And gardens and horticulture really has very little value, or you know, if it has value, it's nowhere near as good. We need to kind of think differently about that and maybe open our minds a bit more to the evidence that's building, that everything's on a continuum, on a gradient. Some things are good, some things are bad, but it's not all of that is bad and all of that is good. It's much more complex. And I think so many gardeners and so many people in the horticultural world have this feeling of guilt, perhaps, that you know, you're always told you're not doing the right thing, you're not doing a good thing, you should be doing things differently. Well, again, there's a need to reevaluate exactly what is working and what isn't working. Maybe we can talk about that as part of the panel. I'm not going to throw too much science around because I'm in the presence of people who can talk about this far more than I can and can probably argue about it much more. And of course, you can pick your sources of evidence, but you know, I've done quite a lot of reading about this, and this is a paper that is fairly typical of the evidence that starts to build. In a suburb of Davis in California, surveys of native butterflies found a surprisingly amount of not just support in terms of nectar, but egg laying and larval feeding on non-native plants. And you know, what I would say about this is there's so much more research that needs to be done to pull these stories and these discussions apart, that sometimes some of the things that we say are the right things to do are not necessarily the right things to do, and some of the things that we say are the wrong things to do are not necessarily the wrong things to do. So anyway, I want to really finish off, I think, by just looking at a couple of projects, but just to come back to my story at the start, where I tried to think about what was different about what I saw in the countryside, you know, some wonderful natural habitats, and what I experienced in most gardens. And I think one of the things that really struck me that was different, it's changed now, was that this sense of the plants in the garden, in the natural landscape, of course, are fitted to the site. They've got there, they've survived there through huge amounts of pressures and stresses and so on. They're totally fitted to the site. But there was also this sense, I think, that I really wanted to work with more, this sense of a complete ecosystem. It's not just the plants, it's about, in this instance, dead wood and all the fungi and microbial activity in the soils and that whole web of life, which so often is missing from our gardens and our horticultural landscapes, which have been cleaned of that ecosystem. I think as well, one thing that really struck me was just the way we use plants, and you know, plants in natural habitats, of course, usually are intimately associated with each other. They're mixed together. It's very difficult to see where one plant or one group of plants starts and where one stops. And that's very different to the way we not often have used plants in horticultural settings, where you have big blocks or individuals of one plant, and then you have another block or individuals of another. And it's quite separated, it's quite formalized. But I think, to me, more and more, the biggest difference, which I try and work with a lot, is the sense of being immersed in a natural environment that is an active experience. And I think a lot of our experience of gardens and design landscapes can be quite low energy. You know, you have your flower bed and you stand back and you look at the flower bed and you say, well, I like that or I don't like that. But you're an observer. It's quite low energy. But being in the middle of a fantastic woodland or meadow, you are part of it. You're an actor. You're not just an observer. And it's a high energy experience because it's what you taste, it's what you smell, it's what you feel, and not just what you see. So this is something that I try and capture a lot. And I think this is a really important thing which I will just highlight before we finish off with a couple of projects. 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time in Southern California when they had a super bloom event in the mountains, which is where the whole landscapes change color and appearance through flowers. And it's quite a rare occurrence. Once in every 20 years, perhaps, you have to have specific weather conditions to encourage this to happen in the desert landscapes. But when it does happen, like here, whole mountain ranges change color with flowers. And when I was there, you can't plan for this. I just happened to be there when it happened, not because I planned to be there. It was so amazing. It wasn't just a super bloom, it was a mega bloom. It was just huge scale. So coming closer to these, this is all Californian poppies in full flower. But interesting, as you start to get closer in, what appears to be just sheets of the same thing becomes more diverse and more complex, with a mix here of permanent shrubs with all the flowers appearing around them. And a little bit closer in, what at a distance appears to be sheets of the same thing becomes more complex. And that's an interesting way that I like to work with gardens and design landscapes ecologically, big scale impressions, but lots of detail and diversity closer up. Anyway, the point of me just mentioning this was that as well as being a visual spectacle, it was a social spectacle as well, because people traveled hours and hours by car to get here. In fact, when I was there at one weekend, I think 500,000 people just went to the one spot that I was at, causing huge amounts of chaos in the surroundings. But what I wanted to point out here was that the experience of people in this sort of landscape, and we all know about poppy fields here and tulip fields in Holland, is very different to what I really refer to as that low energy garden experience that we often have, in that there's something about this kind of natural but colorful and invigorating type of experience that makes people want to be part of it, want to get into it. So, there's somebody here off the path, people here in amongst it. And of course, this is causes a lot of negativity because of the damage it causes to the soils and so on. But it's quite localized near the honeypot areas. But equally, a lot of negativity about people just turning up and, like here, laying around, swimming in the flowers, having their photos taken for social media, then going away again. Such a shallow experience. So a lot of negativity, but to me, the fact that people are traveling hours and hours to get there, the fact that it's mostly young people, and the fact that people, want to record this experience, to me, it's a really important thing. It's saying something really profound about a need that many of us have for this contact with uplifting and amazing natural experiences. So when I see something like this, I kind of think, well, why should it be a 1 in 20-year event? Why should it be something that only people who can drive 4 or 5 hours to get to it get to see? Why can't it be something that, is down the street or in the park or in the schoolyard or in the garden? Why can't this be much more of the experience that we have day to day in our natural designed environments? And again, this is where the horticultural aspect comes in. In the Olympic Park, we kind of created design super blooms, and exactly the same thing really happened. As you can see in this image here, there's a guy having his photo taken from a woman on a path. There's a young girl in there. There's something about this naturalistic but colorful but invigorating experience that makes people want to be part of it. And what an amazing thing that is. So I've just put some words here: positive, uplifting, overwhelming, calming, refreshing, healing, energizing, joyful. So I think, as well as having this power through horticulture, natural, ecological horticulture, to clean up and dry out and to do all these wonderful environmental things, we have the power also to do amazing things for people, to kind of unlock something that's often buried deep inside, almost childlike feelings of liberation, I think. It's all about this sense of being immersed in this wonderful natural environment. It doesn't have to be all bright, wow colors everywhere. It can be very calm, very green, but there's a sense of repetition here. This is from the Barbican. So I do think there's something special about this sort of ecological horticulture that does allow us to reach parts of people that other types of horticulture simply can't reach. And it's about amplifying that natural experience. It's about enhancing that to some extent. So really, a lot of what I do, to different degrees, is about bringing colorful nature into cities, into everyday environments. You can't do it everywhere, but I think in hotspots, it's a really powerful thing to do. I just wanted to mention, I'm not going to do this in any depth, but in terms of horticulture, and it comes back to the point where I was saying that just saying we have nature-based solutions and any sort of greening is good, it's not quite as simple as that, and there's a huge amount of work to be done about choosing the right plants for function. We've only just started doing that. This is a piece of work from a few years ago looking at different diversities and different species for green roofs and putting known amounts of water into different vegetations and measuring how much water comes out from the base. And diversity, how many different plant species, what types of plant species have a significant effect on how much water runs out of a system like this. That's just one function. Or here, again, I'm not expecting anyone to look at this, it's comparing the amount of water running out of a system like this with the density of roots, the root mass, dry weight of roots, for different species or combinations. And the higher the root mass, the less water leaves the system. But that varies according to the plant species. So there's a huge amount of potential to look at functionality of different plant species and combinations to achieve maximum function. This is another piece of work looking at bioswales, those ditches, the amount of water going to those and how much water comes out, comparing simple vegetation types, mown grass, bare soil, or diverse vegetation. And basically the results here are the more diverse vegetation keeps more water in the system. And again, these are kind of evidence, I think, of how universities and researchers can influence how things are done in the real world. So, to finish off all of this, these are kind of some of the principles I work with, high ecological function, producing landscapes, horticulture that are adapted to the future in terms of climate change. Low input, high impact, low resource use, water, chemicals, energy. Simple maintenance, it has to be key when we're looking at public landscapes and gardens. We can do wonderful things, but if they can't be maintained simply, then that's just kind of a waste of time, and things that look good. And this typically is an order of priority that a lot of more ecologically focused advocates would have, priority of principles. I kind of switch those around really, like I've indicated, and put the visual appeal top for these very urban, people-focused applications. So just to finish off with, zipping through a few projects. This is a recent one in Brighton, a linear sequence of parks in Brighton, Valley Gardens. The sea is at the bottom in this image, linking together. And previously, this was a big traffic island surrounded by lanes of traffic, mown grass, trees, hardly anybody really got into them. This project here has taken several lanes of car traffic out, given that back to pedestrian. Increased access into the space, but also changed mown grassland into diverse meadow-type planting, which you can see as a strip going all along the right side of that image. And it was only implemented really during the lockdown last year, so these are some very early photos that were sent to me. But I just put them up quickly to say, I think, that this very wild, very natural, but colourful nature works really, really well in cities against urban architecture. It doesn't just have to be in the most natural places that you can think of. I think what's really striking about this, and I just put a quote up, I think, at the end, which I've lifted from somebody on Instagram. which is quite typical, really. It comes back to that California experience that so many people interacting with the plants, and that is something which I think is so crucial to this whole approach. Let's flip through a few images from the Barbican, which I think is, to me, one of the examples of this idea of transforming the way places look, the way they work, the way they function. The Barbican itself, as you know, is this kind of modernist, brutalist, urban, grey world that is a residential estate for 4,000 people living there, as well as having the arts and cultural complexes. Everything you see here is rooftop, it's all podium. Although it feels like it's on the ground, there are lecture theatres, art galleries, all sorts of other things, car parks underneath. And the landscape is what you might call municipal, mown grass, big blocks of monocultures, and maintenance to keep bare soil beneath these blocks of monocultural plants. And to keep it fresh and green in the rooftop, the previous landscape had a lot of supplemental irrigation and watering all the time. I was asked to come in 5 or 6 years ago because a leak had developed in the waterproofing on this podium landscape, and water was getting in to the buildings below. And the only way they could fix that was to strip the whole of the existing landscape off and put a new one back in its place. And I was asked to come in and do that. And I guess I used all those principles that we've just talked about to replace something like this with something that would be more diverse and more ecologically dynamic. So this is how it looks now, and in the springtime there's a lot of flowering bulbs, but it couldn't be more different. It's a matrix of grasses and flowering perennials. A lot of winter green plants, so it's fresh and green in the winter, and then seasonal highlights which pop up at different times of the year. So this very meadowy matrix has, for example, in May and June, alliums like this coming through with oriental poppies. Now, the thing about this is that although it's very fresh and green in the first half of the year, this is not irrigated, so everything dries off. And this is really the point I was making about things looking different and things being different to normal. Because it starts to look like this once we get beyond July and we have much more seed heads and ripening off. So it's different, and I think it looks different, it looks attractive, and I can't tell you how many people tell me how the naturalness of this is really working against the boldness of the urban architecture. So coming into the winter, we have a lot of seed heads and wintergreen structures. But as a result of this difference, there's been a 70% reduction in water use compared to the more traditional intensive horticulture. So my last project is the Greater Green Scheme in Sheffield, which is, as was mentioned at the start, the UK's longest green street and biggest retrofit kind of water management scheme. The blue line is the River Don that flows through Sheffield, and in 2007 we had catastrophic flooding which caused millions of pounds of damage and killed one person. And as a result, a lot of initiatives were taken to stop that happening again. This is a valley formation, so water runs down the valley sides into the river. And this green strip is where the Greater Green Scheme is. And part of the idea was that water would flow down the valley sides and be captured in this linear sequence of gardens. It previously was a street, a dual carriageway, the main ring road around the centre of Sheffield. And here's a visual of the proposals, which was to reduce the amount of traffic lanes by 2, and then use the liberated space for gardens and for horticulture, multifunctional horticulture. And this is how it is. These are photos from 2019, before the lockdown. I think I took these photos as the sun was coming up, so nobody around. But I think what's amazing to me is that the intensity of horticulture is probably as good as you would find in the highest maintained gardens around the country, but this is on the street, maintained under typical local authority conditions. There's nothing special about this. So this is early in the morning with very little going on, but there it is a bit later on. And what amazed me really is how natural it seems to people to be walking along this for a mile of just continuously going through this sort of thing. It just kind of very quickly becomes part of the background. This was a second phase of it that was planted up last year, and I took these photos in June of this year. We have the road on the right, pedestrian pavement on the left, another strip of planting, and on the other side of that there's a cycleway. So cars, people and cycles are separated out in this phase. But again, I think what strikes me is the incredible diversity of planting and the fact that this isn't in a cutting-edge, radical garden with huge amounts of resources. This is on the street in inner city Sheffield. And there's nothing special about the maintenance regime or the budgets. What I would say, interestingly, to finish off with here, I think, is that the comparison of the maintenance budget before this was done and after this was done, so before when it was a road and pavements, is the results are that the maintenance of this scheme is less in terms of cost than what was there before. And you know, when people see this sort of thing, they say, oh, you can't do that. It's too expensive. It's too expensive to make, it's too expensive to maintain. While the actual figures, the numbers show that it's not. It's actually cheaper to maintain this than what was previously hard surface and traditional drainage systems. So that's the sense of the transformation from that to that sense of immersing in a natural environment on the street. And a very dynamic planting. This is a picture from May of this year with Siberian iris, a lot of green, and this is the same from August, September. And then this is the same from the winter of this year. So everything is left to stand up over the winter and then cut back in February, March. So I think I will finish there with perhaps a vision of the future with the streets becoming the gardens and the possibility that we can work with a rich horticultural diversity that works for people as well as for the wider environment. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you very much for your presentation. Lots of food for thought there for gardeners and professionals and scientists amongst us this afternoon. I was particularly struck by your detailed thought and consideration in your presentation right from the very beginning as a child. And clearly your early childhood had a profound effect on you, which has taken you through your adult life and your professional life, and your consideration to detail and the detail of spending time in and considering nature and natural places and natural ecosystems. Just before we go to the panel, could we have a few questions for Nigel from the audience, please? So just put your hand up. I think we've got a couple of Futures volunteers with roving mics at the back, so just put your hand up if you've got a question. So there's a lady right at the back there.
Hello. Right, my turn? Okay, thank you very much indeed. I've got a garden about 4 meters wide by maybe 8 or 10 long, which it started as grass and now has spring bulbs in, and it's sensational. But basically what I want to do for the rest of the year is what you've been doing in the Barbican and Sheffield. Where can I read your planting lists and your techniques and things like that?
Well, there was a very good book that was brought out in 2020 or 2019 called Naturalistic Planting Design, The Essential Guide. And the author is myself. So a lot of that is in there. I would say that, you know, that the starting point, yes, is looking at plant lists. I think, though, that one of the really exciting things about this whole approach is that it does still, forget about being university researchers, I think it still has so much scope for experimentation at home, for just trying things out, for just doing things. And I think particularly when you've got a small space and it's yours, then why not try things? And if it doesn't work, well, you've learned something. If it does work, well, maybe you're the first person to ever have done that. So I think I never like prescribing, say, that's the list of plants that you should use for that particular location. I think that's always a starting point. It's like a recipe. It's there to be adaptive. So I think that's the best advice, really. It's about having a go. And I think one of the things that typifies a lot of what I do is that I'm not necessarily seeking out the rarest, most hard to find things and saying, well, look at this wonderful plant here. That's the only place you'll ever see that growing. Very often I am using plants which are widely available, but just using them differently. And I think that's kind of an important thing if we want to make this more mainstream, that the plants have to be available. And then you can start to add specialist things. What I would really say, though, it's about this kind of diversity, not just diversity of plant species in space, but it's diversity through time as well, so that you've got a whole range of early flowering things, mid-season, late season. And the way we do that, of course, is having these layers of different plants coming through. So one of the tricks, really, to achieve this sort of effect without the need for a lot of traditional horticultural craft of deadheading and a lot of heavy maintenance, is to have earlier flowering plants that don't mind things coming up around them and creating a bit of shade underneath them. So quite a lot of our native woodland plants, so long as it's not hugely dry, are quite good underneath taller perennials because it feels like they're in more of a woodland situation. So primroses work really well in amongst taller perennials because they will kind of tick over underneath during the summer but give you that lovely spring display. And of course the other thing is, just learning to celebrate the seed heads and the winter forms and structures. It's not just all about the flowers. So I would say have a go. And I use quite a lot of plants, at least to begin with, per square meter, maybe it's 9 or 10 plants a square meter. And some of those I know won't be there forever, so they're quick flowering things or short-lived things, but they fill the space up before the longer-term plants find their own space. So, that's the best advice I can have. Don't necessarily just find a list of plants and try and copy that. Use that as a starting point, but have a go yourself to play around with it.
Okay, thank you, Nigel, and thank you very much for the question. Because time is ticking on, I'd like to move straight to the panel discussion. So can I ask the 3 panel members, please, to come up to the low stage? So this is the second part of this afternoon. It's a chance to have a discussion with the panel members. Nigel's going to join them as well. So feel free to ask anything about their work or anything you've got in mind, question you've always wanted to ask about nature, the plants in your garden, anything that you're curious about those subjects. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Jane Memmott, OBE, Professor of Ecology at the School of Biological Sciences here at the University of Bristol. Jane Memmott is an ecologist, an entomologist, and Professor of Ecology here at the University of Bristol. Her research focuses on community ecology, and she is an expert on the interactions between insect pollinators and plants. Jane was appointed Officer of Order of the British Empire, OBE, in 2021 in the Queen's Birthday Honours List for services to insect pollinators and ecology. Jane is also Director of the University of Bristol Botanic Garden. We're also joined by Dr. Heather Whitney, sitting in the middle here, Reader in Plant Interactions here at the University of Bristol School of Biological Sciences. Heather's research looks into how the structure of the plant's surface can influence both biotic and abiotic interactions. She uses a range of techniques to investigate these interactions, including plant molecular biology, optical analysis, biometrics, and animal behavioral assays. And in fact, Heather's research students have used plants from the Botanic Garden on wax surfaces, and Heather works with me to run a second-year field course where we put the students in the garden to actually have a look at how the plants are interacting with pollinators, a subject that we call bioimaging. And then finally, we've got Dr. Daniel Dietrecht, lecturer at the School of Biological Sciences. She's a plant molecular biologist here in Bristol. Her work is aimed at understanding how environmental factors such as water, gravity, and nutrients influence root growth, and how this knowledge can be used to grow crops more sustainably. And Nigel's joining the panel as well. So will you please welcome your panel? So can we have a first question, please, from the audience for the panel? And if the volunteers with the roving mics are out and about, then we can actually get those questions there quickly. So the gentleman over here, please, just put your hand up. Have a think of, listen to the answers. It might provoke a question for you.
Hello,
okay.
yeah, thanks for the really good talk. I was quite captured, I suppose, or inspired by when you said that we need to really step up the scale of not just playing on the edges with these sort of nature-based solutions and thinking about doing it on like a city-wide scale. And equally, I suppose, to the other panel members, you know, if we're interested in using horticulture to bring solutions, what I want to ask you all maybe to give your thoughts on what is the largest scale example that you can think of where, you know, these practices that we could use to solve issues have been applied on a big scale, you know, rather than just one nice park. Like what city do you think of as the best example around the world?
Nigel, do you want to
I think what I would say is that maybe we haven't got there yet in terms of saying, well, you know, there's this amazing, incredible example, but in ecology, very often the idea of mosaics, where you have relatively small spaces, is how you think about maximizing diversity of plants and animals and interactions. So I think that, to me, is the best way to think about cities as mosaics, and the whole range of different types of space and uses and functions can contribute to that. I think the key thing is about connecting them all up, which is why this emphasis on streets and linear connectors is so important. So it's not just a lot of isolated individual initiatives, but there's some connectivity to them. So I think that's probably the most crucial thing.
Jane, would you like to comment a bit on your research and its application?
My mic is working? Yeah, great. Definitely the connectivity is really important. So in terms of a really glamorous way of doing it, something like the High Line in New York. And so I had some undergraduate students here design what we called the Low Line, which was the route that Nigel took from here to the station, and try and put one of those into Bristol, and then link up various other habitats. But in the absence of that, road verges can be incredibly important. And just not mowing them, people are getting around to the idea that you don't need to mow everything all of the time. And actually it's cheaper not to mow and better for biodiversity. And so those road verges and those kind of edges of pavement give you this reticulate network that covers the whole city, actually, and then, along motorways joins up places. So there's lots of opportunities out there, but that patchiness, or the hot spots, which are kind of the gardens and the allotments, joined up by, a network of things that allow pollinators and birds and things to commute across the cities. That's what's needed.
And I think, so you've made a very interesting point about scale. So I'm going to ask Heather, if you'd like to comment a bit, perhaps about some of your research, like on wax surfaces, the effects that could have on, say, agriculture.
Absolutely, because it's connecting not just the city to the people, but also then the city into the agricultural landscape around it. And once you get into that scale, the differences you could make could be really significant. So Nick's mentioned the waxy surfaces and how that can really alter how water flows through a system. So for example, there are some plants that have surface structures that can almost sponge-like get the water to adhere to the surface, others that actually self-clean and the water rolls off them, and obviously that will be different depending on where you plant those. it could have massive impact on how water flows through an entire landscape. So it's both the leaf structure, the leaf surface structure, and then how that then feeds into the soil structure and the roots that are part of that structure. And if then how that's all interconnected to the agricultural plants that we're growing on a massive scale, what some people are doing at the moment is going back to the wild ancestors of some of the crops that we're growing at the moment and looking for greater diversity in those wild ancestors and seeing if those can be used, for example, to change the waxes on the leaf surfaces and how that can then be used to, again, alter how well water goes through a landscape.
And really that question is pertinent to Daniela, especially as Nigel's mentioned about the total ecosystem and considering the soil and what's going on with the roots. So Daniela, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, so water is really important because 70 to almost 80% of global freshwater is used in agriculture. So there are currently predictions around that we need to almost double food production within a very short time span. So managing how plants use water is fundamental to this. And crop breeding in the past has focused a lot on the shoot parts, so the parts above ground, which are easy to see. But we're only now getting around to looking how roots can be also used to make plants better at growing with less resources. So that's going to be an important contribution of research there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, next question. So if we could go to the lady with the green shirt on there first, then we'll come to you, sir.
Hiya. So you spoke a lot in the talk about how you can rule wild areas, but a lot of it seems to be more sort of like you said, like natural wildlife. But seeing as though we're trying to sort of incorporate more food production locally, would that be something that, on a low maintenance scale, would be sort of worked in the future?
If you understand. The acoustics aren't that great.
Sorry.
Actually,
Sorry.
Thank you.
For local food production to be sort of incorporated into more of the rewilding projects of urban landscapes. Would that be something that would be maybe more of a possibility in the future? Because it doesn't seem to be there right now compared to other places in Europe.
So if I got that right, it's about the combination of food production in planting combined into urban landscapes, along with the ecology and the aesthetics as well. It doesn't seem to be there at the moment. So a comment on that. Perhaps Nigel, if you go first.
Well, I think I should defer really, because I think really one of the most important studies that has been produced on urban pollinators recently, I think Jane was involved with, really indicated that allotments in cities were the places for pollinator diversity. And it's something I didn't mention just because I think that's not what I work with, but I think the potential for food growing mixed in with all of these other things has to be part of the picture. There's a guy who's sort of based in the southwest, Sid somebody, I can't remember his name, who works with edible meadows, seeded meadows with flowers for pollinators, but also plants which can be either used for foliage but also root crops as part of that whole system. So I think that kind of has a lot of potential for the future of combining productivity with biodiversity support, but also visual beauty.
Do any other panel members want to contribute?
Allotments really are hugely important for biodiversity in cities. And what's really nice about them is that they're really good for biodiversity. They're also really good for people. People that have allotments are kind of happier and healthier and more vigorous in all sorts of if you read the literature on it. So, and it's also really good for sustainability. So you've actually got a win-win-win situation. And also some of the, traditional kitchen gardens, pottagers were very pretty to look, they're lovely to look at, and they're really useful. So, and yeah, with vertical farming, there's all sorts of possibilities actually. So, and in Portishead, where I do my Saturday chores, it's one of the urban planting things is about. You go along and you pick your beans and things. So, I think it's a good combination.
I'd just like to add to your question about food growing within the city. The Royal Horticultural Society has done a survey which shows there's around about 3% of UK food production is done on allotments or grown in people's gardens or grown where they live. Just after the Second World War, it was 18%. So there's been a big shift downwards. But there's a lot of community initiatives, and I'm very struck about the interest in Bristol, the dynamism in Bristol. 25 years ago, we ran a horticultural course at the Botanic Garden. Part of that is teaching people how to grow plants, and part of that is teaching them how to grow food. And that course is very, very popular. And we've increased the numbers of those. So currently we have 8 of those running every week. That's 159 adult learners in Bristol. And we could fill those courses 3 times over. And you have to ask yourself, who are these people that are interested? Are these all retired gardeners looking to increase their time? There's less than half a dozen retired people on these courses. Are they teenagers? Is this the new interest where Nigel had, the new rock and roll for teenagers? There are no teenagers on these horticultural courses. But the youngest people are 23, 24, 25, running up to 50, 55. It's working age population, and there's a huge interest. People have allotments, as been said. People work in community gardens. There's quite a number of guerrilla gardeners, and there's a huge number of white-collar workers who've had enough and want to do something different. And one thing's for sure, if we look at the issues surrounding leaving Europe and where our food comes from, we are looking at trying in this country, the governments are getting interested in looking at growing more food in this country. And to mitigate the effects of climate change, we're going to have to grow more food locally to offset the dramatic events we might see with extreme climate events in urban centres. So it's a very pertinent question. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the gentleman with the hat here.
It's really in terms of fertility, how you maintain fertility, especially in the more artificial setting, but also I assume municipal compost is playing quite a large role in it. And is there any research done into exactly how the soil and plants and nature is responding towards that?
Did you hear that? This is really perhaps for Danielle, first of all. It was about municipal compost and any research on the kind of response to municipal compost that soil animals and organisms at a macro and micro level have had, as opposed to natural soil.
It's, I mean, I can't say anything directly about municipal compost, but that's certainly an area which has hugely picked up in research recently, is soil microbiomes, because people are now getting onto that idea that a plant doesn't live in isolation in the soil. It's not just the community of different plants that are living together, but there's these whole communities of bacteria and fungi which are supremely important for how a plant grows and how well it also copes with other stresses. So plant diseases, how a plant is vulnerable to that really depends on its own microbial community. So very important research area at the moment.
Many of you may be aware that you can buy soil mycorrhizal fungi to actually sprinkle on the roots of shrubs and trees when you plant. We do some of this at the Botanic Garden. I do it at home, and the results are quite dramatic. You get a much higher, much more successful establishment of that plant because the relationship between the soil mycorrhiza and the plant you're planting is actually key to its success. So there's lots of direct applications that the public can do now by just going to your garden centre and nursery and buying soil mycorrhiza, which helps you get a good kick start and would certainly help establishing plants in municipal compost. Right, can we have another question, please? There's a lady at the back there, and then could we come to the lady there?
Hi, yeah, I think there's probably a certain disconnect between the implementation of these nature-inspired landscapes and the way that actually horticulturalists are often trained, for example, at further education colleges. They're often trained in very traditional techniques that then it's almost like there's a resistance then to change, and it's, you know, how do we go about kind of combating that resistance to very traditional techniques within horticulture? So how do we overcome these barriers? Certainly, I am a lecturer at a further education college in horticulture, and what is often within the curriculum is very much still very traditional techniques. You know, so there's almost like a resistance to not, you know, to mowing regimes, etc. Doing no mow is kind of still very much a big no-no within those curriculum courses. So it'd be really interesting to see your opinions on that. How do we overcome those barriers?
I can kick off on that.
Yeah.
I actually think doing this is a really important part of it. So it's been a big change in universities about public engagement and talking not just to other academics. So I think this is a really important element of getting these ideas more widely out there. I'll just talk about the Sheffield experience. Because we have a momentum in Sheffield, you know, with the university, myself and James Hitchmo, we've conducted research programs, but have worked hand in hand with local council and agencies on the ground to implement all of that. As a result, we have landscape contractors now who know how to do this. And so some of the more traditional issues of we haven't got anybody who knows how to do this. But a big part of that work has been about apprenticeships and working with the local colleges to get these ideas embedded. So there's an organisation called Green Estate in Sheffield that it has the contracting responsibility for this type of work in Sheffield, and they're involved for the first 3 years as the landscape contractors, and then it reverts to the normal city council workforce. So those crucial years are the first years to get it up and running, and then it's more of a routine maintenance after that. So to answer your question, I think it's crucial what you've just highlighted, because it's about, like I said, really a change in practice across the board. And to me, I think one of the things that I've tried to do by kind of taking this more artful approach, more radical approach, if you like, is to make the idea of gardening and public horticulture an exciting one and a creative one, and not just a mundane, routine one. I would just add in as well, you know, a lot of projects I'm involved with, I continue involvement after planting and through maintenance, and often have a lot of, you know, follow-up work with gardeners on the projects. And it amazes me each time how very often gardeners have no idea what the projects are about. So the Barbican, for example, I gave a little presentation about it to the gardeners. They said it's the first time anybody had ever explained to them what the ideas were behind a scheme. And just doing that immediately helped the understanding about what to do and, you know, what not to do. So I've found myself, there's this kind of latent creativity in a lot of gardeners, city gardeners, that is just never allowed to express itself because of this rut of training and traditional horticulture. So that cycle has to be broken. And I think it's at the training stage, apprenticeships, and having this link, I think, with research and practice and things on the ground as much as possible. So it's a really, really important thing to highlight.
Yeah, a couple of points to add to that. One way of kind of concentrating people's minds is to point out that it's often cheaper to do it ecologically. So that actually is an amazingly powerful tool that's nothing to do with science or kind of plants or anything, but the people that control the purse strings can be brought on board if those sorts of sums are on the table. The other thing is to actually, if you think more holistically about kind of where money's spent, there's a huge amount of evidence showing that time spent in green space is really good for your physical and mental health. So, you know, you could be saving a huge amount of money for people's, you know, the cost of keeping people, allowing them to stay healthy, So if we have more joining up between, health services and horticultural services and things like that. And there's really good evidence from, I think it was Leipzig in Germany, where people that live close to large old trees, there's a significantly reduced use of antidepressants. Having that vegetation around makes a difference. And then just finally, Nigel did say at the end of his introduction that botany no longer existed at Bristol, and he's right, it was closed about 10 years ago. But 3 or 4 years ago, we started a new degree called, it's just rebranded Plant Sciences. Plant Sciences, it's botany, but it's just a more modern approach. So people with that sort of training in plants is kind of the people we need coming in, because Nigel's stuff is about applied plant competition, basically. It's about how to get communities that live together without thug species A taking over the whole border, basically. And you've got to understand the science of how communities work. And then with people like me, getting the pollinators coming in and the herbivores. So I think that the wheels of the machine are changing, I think. I'd like to think in 10, 20 years, the world will literally look a lot greener. As you walk down from here to the station, there's no reason why it couldn't be a bit more like the High Line. You can't do the railway bit, but you can do it on the ground. And that would be just fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for that very pertinent question. Right, can we have the lady here, please? Sarah, if you'd like to put your hand up, just so that we can see where you are. Excellent. And then can we have the question at the back again?
I was wondering, to make these large-scale changes, how do you convince people? How do you get the big, unrelated businesses that don't really care about anything but the bottom line? How do you get them involved and on board in order to make these changes?
Okay.
I think that there isn't a silver bullet, but things like, companies pay a lot of money to keep their staff. When they lose staff, that's expensive. If they actually have a much nicer working environment, people like having lots of office plants. They like having a nice bit of green space to sit in. So there could be potentially a saving there, where it's actually, again, saving you money if you actually have a nice green environment for them. I think it's something very deep in us. We all like sitting near a fire crackling. We all like being by the sea. And, everybody likes those big floral landscapes. So I think I know I'm not even the most hardened, kind of money person or whatever could be converted, but an awful lot of people can be converted.
I think that's quite right. And to me, I think sometimes it's about changing the story. Not necessarily using all the arguments that we might want to use about how wonderful it is for everything else, but to use really hard-nosed economic arguments. And sometimes people in the natural world feel very uncomfortable talking about money and economics, but unfortunately that is the way that kind of those arguments are won. And so, as Jane says, it's cheaper, but also there's so much evidence, not just about long-term economic and health benefits, but short-term ones in terms of, let's say, retail areas that have a lot of natural content. People spend more money in them when people travel further to get there. They spend longer there, and I think those sorts of arguments start to be persuasive, in addition to all the environmental and ecological arguments. So I would say change the story and address what the people you're talking to are really going to be interested in, not necessarily what you think are the primary objectives.
I think if I could just contribute to your question. Obviously here at the university we deal with a lot of young people, thousands and thousands of young people, and a lot of change is coming from young people, teenagers upwards. In the last few years students have created a Roots community group, which is now official university society that works in local communities. There's a plant society. We've got burgeoning numbers of biologists here at the university, the keenest, brightest young people, and young people want to make change. And with the global news feed, when what's happening around the world with climate change and what is or isn't happening with politicians is fed into our phones and our computers instantly, there is an expectation of change from the ground up, and companies will have to, and some of them are playing catch up, have to respond to this and respond with regard to their green credentials, so therefore embrace. So people like Nigel, who's doing a very sort of front of house, is very, very visible. where Jane and Heather and Daniela are doing the scientific study that informs the kind of practice, change will come. And we need examples like this, and we need researchers to give us well-informed advice and evidence-based advice of what we need to do. So companies will, their customers are going to tell them what they want, particularly the younger customers. So I think change will come. No, one more question, please. No, there was somebody at the back wanted the question. They put a hand up there. Thank you.
Hi, my question is linked to the previous view. I wondered how receptive city councils are to the new concepts of planting. And for example, how much discussion is there between, say, the university research going on and possible future planting plans in the city?
I think that's a question perhaps for Jane and
I can
university.
certainly here in Bristol, they are receptive actually. So there was recently a conference on it was to do with kind of friends groups and working with local parks, and people are really interested. And the Urban Pollinators project that was run from here in Bristol, I mean, the council, that was done collaboratively with the local council and with local wildlife groups in 4 cities actually, so Bristol, Reading, Leeds and Edinburgh. And so those teams, I'm really interested in, to solve most of society's problems, it's not a single discipline that can do it. You need multidiscipline teams. So when you put together kind of scientists and ecologists and engineers, because Nigel's sorts of projects you need to talk to the people that dig the drains and make the roads and the hard engineers, and then the social scientists as well. When you get all of those together, and so by actually doing your projects collaboratively with the people that need the information, you can move things along much, much faster, to the extent that, the Urban Pollinators project finished about 5 years ago, but I'm still in touch with the regular touch with the ecologists at the council. So I think it's really important there is that dialogue, and Bristol certainly, the university prides itself as being, part of our responsibility is to interact with, the city on our doorstep. And my subversive aim is to get it a lot greener than it really is at the moment. So, there's ways and means of that. The collaborations really make a difference.
Any other?
I found that my most productive relationships are not with the leadership, but with people who are doing things and officers. And certainly that's been my way in. And it's often very small steps, slow steps, rather than big, grand things. So I guess when I was younger, I was very impatient to get things done, but I've learned, things happen by small steps, and you gradually get there. But yeah, I've certainly found to form those relationships with people who can make changes rather than necessarily the people at the top of the organisation can often be a good way to get things going.
Okay. Can we have just one quick question here, and then that'll be our final question, because I'm being signalled that we're running out of time. Sarah's coming with the mic. She's doing her 10,000 steps today. Sir, yes, you there.
I was just wondering what the sort of time scale that you set from sort of proposal and those initial conversations about projects to actually carrying it out and implementing it, and then whether you also have time scales for like the maintenance beyond that, and working plans for how you actually integrate all the sort of amenity horticultures to actually make sure that those plans sustain themselves and also inform future projects.
There was quite a lot in that question, and of course it varies. So a couple of the projects I showed, the Barbican, for example, huge amount of consultation. It put the whole project back by a year because of the amount of consultation that had to be done. And it was hugely positive because it involved a lot of people, and it changed the scheme quite radically according to that. And that then has led on to quite a lot of very high involvement. There was really as a direct result of that, a gardening group at the Barbican was formed to help maintain that landscape. A key element of the Greater Green was consultation with businesses who might be affected by those changes on the street around where they were. And it's kind of interesting to me as an academic It involved a lot of nighttime, evening meetings and weekend meetings with stakeholders. So I think those are big schemes where the consultation is really fundamental to getting that acceptance, because it's all about this transformational change. And you cannot transform places without that buy-in, that consultation, that really detailed involvement. That's very different to a small community-based scheme. A lot of the projects that are not quite so glamorous as these ones that I'm involved with are with community groups and very much self-help. And I'm involved there to give help and support, but they are initiated and carried out through community groups. And this is where I think the point about slow, small steps, which are achievable, is perhaps as important as these big grand schemes which get a lot of kind of attention. I think, a small scheme which might be no bigger than this stage, that is achieved and is sustainable, could maybe have as much influence as one of these big schemes that gets a lot of attention, because you've got something on the ground that works and you can bring people to, and you can meet with other people, and you can really say, well, look, this is how it works for real. So it's a difficult question to answer because things are so different, but all I can say is that consultation, that engagement really has to be fundamental to the way projects can work into the future.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. I'm being signalled we're out of time. I've just got 2 more things to say. Firstly, there's a card on your seat or near your seat. It's a white card. Could you quickly spend 30 seconds filling it out and leaving it either on the seat or on the desk at the entrance? And the blue card, could you take that away with you, please, and have a look online at other events that are going on. I'd like to thank Nigel Dunnett, our keynote speaker, for travelling here today and sharing his knowledge and experience with us. And I'd like to thank our 3 panel members from the University of Bristol for contributing their expertise to the discussion, and thank all of you for coming here today to share in this Futures 2021 experience. So please, can you put your hands together for the panel, please? Thank you.